Hello and welcome back to Prism and Company. On the docket today, my entire deck collection. That includes tarot decks and like one oracle deck and kind of like half another. You'll see, it's mostly tarot decks. I currently have 15 decks in my collection and I don't really plan to get any more than that. There's something about just this enormous collection that doesn't appeal to me. And I say that as an avid collector. If my parents are watching this right now, they're like shaking their head like, yep. I just love collecting things. I'm like a bird at heart. I just like, ooh, something shiny. I gotta like collect it for the nest. But, 2019, embracing the minimal, trying to downsize everything. And so I thought, tarot is a usable art form. I just want to really have the decks that I want to use and I think are really, truly beautiful. So I'm going to talk you through each one, what the art style is like, my 10 favorite cards from that deck, and why I like it, why it made the cut, because I got rid of quite a few decks over the years, just, stuff that I thought I would like and didn't before I really kind of got my feet wet into tarot and understood what I really liked and wanted. Here's a little preview for you. I've got all my cards stacked up in order of when I got them, from the oldest to the newest. What a mess. I could not be more excited. Let's get started. Up first, the Thoth deck. If you watched my video of my top 5 decks that I couldn't live without, you would know that this is my number 1 deck on that list. Spoilers, I guess. I keep it in my 217 bag. Oh, I just love that number. The Thoth deck is the first deck that I got that I still have. My very first deck was the Revelations Tarot, and there were just so many things about that deck that didn't jive with me. And at the time I was like, I'm going to buy a tarot deck. This one looks pretty. And like many impulse decisions that way, it just didn't work out very well. This one, however, has stood the test of time and has proven to be a really, really incredible deck. I'm going to grab over my top 10 cards that I have pulled aside here. And let's see how this works. I'm just going to kind of spread them out and see how it goes. The artwork in this deck is by Lady Frida Harris. Oh boy, I've just doomed myself to have to look up all the artists of all these decks. I should do that. I'm an artist myself. I would very much appreciate if somebody called me out. And all of these are paintings, which is so cool. I have nothing against digital art. In fact, I am a digital artist myself, but there is something very satisfying about actual hand-painted stuff. If I had more time, I would probably hand paint the tarot deck that I'm working on too. But it's just a pain in the butt. But look at this. It's absolutely stunningly gorgeous. Things that jump out to me right away are the color palettes. Each card has a real kind of distinct, unique color palette to it, but there are some consistencies that run through. For example, the yellows that are used are really consistent across multiple cards. I use that when I'm doing a tarot reading to kind of weave a narrative between those colors. So, this very pale yellow showing up here and here might mean something, might add a little bit of flavor or variety to the reading itself. You can see here, there's a bit of a mix between major arcana, minor arcana, and court cards. I just love the heck out of this whole deck. There are very few cards that I dislike, and even then I'm just like, they're pretty good. And there are some decks with some pretty crappy cards that I really like even on this list. So that baseline level of quality is amazing. And then the good cards like these guys are absolutely top tier. Just a little bit of behind the scenes of how I picked my favorite 10. It was partially for the images. Like some of these are very striking. Take this death card, for example. We have the skeleton of death at the bottom of the ocean with all these little sea creatures down here. And he's waving his scythe at the bottom of the ocean, which is churning up the muck and making all these bubbles. And then within these bubbles, they're almost like wombs gestating new life. And then there's also all this kind of geometry weaved in and out through the image too. Then we have the 3 different forms of the zodiac sign Scorpio. So we have the scorpion, the snake, and the eagle. There's just so much imagery and amazingness and beauty packed into, each and every one of these. But also some of these I picked just because I feel like they're iconic to the deck, at least for me. The 4 of Cups, for example. You won't see this a lot if you do, say, a search for the Thoth online. At least I don't think so. But when I first got this deck, something about this really jumped out at me. This almost looked like chandeliers coming down. Those are essentially like rays of water, I suppose you could say, or streams of water coming out of these cups. But something about this image is just so baked into my brain, is like, this is what this deck is. The same thing with the Five of Cups. I actually really like all the cups in this deck. Just because they have this real sense of space to them. It feels like these cups, are in sort of a bog or have these roots that are going into the water. You can kind of see the portion of these guys where they're underneath the waves and get a little bit darker. And I just think that's so cool that, this deck is so full of meaning and life and color, and that there's just so much to pick out of every little card. And I think the reason that it has stood the test of time so much for me is that, this is the deck I really learned with. These are the images that, come to mind when I think about, like, what does the Magician mean? What does the Chariot mean? I'm pulling from this image and then kind of superimposing that onto whatever other deck I'm using. Which, in an ideal world, I think we would kind of meet each deck where it was and read that way. But who's got the time? I only have so much brain space and I have to learn 78 things anyway. Boy, I'm not exactly sure, or I wasn't exactly sure how this is going to go, but I kind of like this. We'll just let each deck sort of speak for itself. I'll touch on a few key pieces that pop out to me and then move on to the next. Alrighty, on to number 2. This next deck is called the Arcane Bullshit Tarot. And I think it's so funny that this is my second deck. It wasn't actually my second deck, but that it is so close to the beginning of my tarot journey. I think it really speaks to where my mind was at, when I first started this process. The thing that appealed to me the most about tarot initially is that it was an art gallery in a deck of cards. And if you know me, I love cards anyway, whether it is playing cards or collectible cards or card games, whatever it is, just the act of shuffling and having information on a card is so cool and appealing. Enough about that though. This is not actually a tarot deck. This is sort of a joke deck that is tarot inspired, and I think it's hilarious. The thing that I like about it though is that it's really, really smart. Oh, here, let me lay out some cards for you. Some of these are really like downright offensive. I tried not to pull any of those for this particular video, but I got some really fun ones that are personal favorites. But this is just poking fun at tarot as an art form. And I think that's so cool. I think every good piece of art, every good movement, every, thing that's worth its salt should be able to take a little bit of heat. And where in tarot you have cards like Death or the Hanged Man or the Hermit, here we have Future Not Found, Card of Card, Knees. And I think it's just so funny. And this deck, let me grab it real quick, is like totally huge. There are tons and tons and tons of these, and it's full of vulgarity and nudity and just ridiculousness. And I absolutely love that. I just can't get enough of it. Some personal favorites. Card of Cards, again, just for my love of cards. I love this kind of Inception card idea that goes down and down and down and down. I also love Everything's Fine, because if you think about a tarot reading, like, what is everybody so afraid of when they first start, either getting a tarot reading or with tarot? It's like, what if like the Death card shows up, or the Ten of Swords with like this dude being stabbed a whole bunch? It's like, no. Like, Death is a great card. Everything's fine. And it's the skull and the explosion. The thing that really makes this deck stand out to me, though, is that it is stunning. A joke tarot deck could have very easily gone ultra cheap with just like really crappy images and just all sorts of stuff. I'm actually going to grab out one image that really jumps to mind here. Actually, I'm not going to show those just because they do get a little bit offensive and I don't want to turn anybody off. This guy right here. Random clip art. Like, this is almost what you imagine this deck would be if I had just told you about it. And I love that this card is in the deck. I think it's hilarious. But no, besides this image, someone took the time to really craft a beautiful, beautiful deck in these stunning black and whites with all of these lines in the background. There's another deck that I actually have in this set called the Wild Unknown Tarot that's really known for having all these different patterns of lines in the background. And this deck kind of did it first hilariously, but in a very, very different way. Yeah, and I think, we'll just wrap it up with meaningless garbage. I think that is the perfect kind of capstone for this particular deck, and it just makes me smile every single time. On to the next. I actually did want to mention, coming back in here, the artist for this deck is Evan Doherty? Daughtery? I'm not going to say the names right. You'll just have to forgive me for not saying the names right. And this is the original indie version before it got a Kickstarter. I guess that's an indie version too. The original like print on demand version. So the backs were different and things like that. I just want to give a shout out to the artist. All right. Up next, we have the very lovely Tarot of the Spirit, painted by Joyce Ekins? Sure. This is another deck that was traditionally painted. By that, I mean actually painted on canvas and then photographed or scanned and reproduced in digital form. And boy, are these cards just total stunners. I actually bought this deck twice. I bought it very, very early on in kind of my tarot life. And at the time, I was really into something called trimming a deck, which is where you take the edges of cards. Let me shift these while I'm talking. As I stop talking, you would take the edges of the cards and cut them off. So for example, this guy, we would cut along the black borders and just leave the image and not have any of the white. You'd lose things like the copyright and just all this extra stuff. And oh, it looks gloriously lovely. Things I did not know about trimming when I first started off. One of them, which was exceedingly obvious, is that you would lose the information on the card. That's one of those things where you say, Colin, my sweet summer child, of course you lose the things that you cut off. But young, innocent, beautiful child Colin, I was like 26 at the time, did not realize that. So I cut this card in particular and immediately regretted it. I was like, wait, I don't know what these butterflies mean. Like, it was a disaster. I cut like this card and two others, immediately realized that I did not want to trim this deck, but I had ruined the whole thing because when you cut paper, you can't put it back together, at least not for a deck of cards that you have to shuffle. So I put it aside, I got rid of it. I think I actually reused some of this art for, other various things. And it took me, I think, years to actually allow myself to rebuy this deck because I felt just so foolish. And luckily it's cheap. This is a mass market deck. It is not very expensive. It was just more the principle of the thing. Some things about the art itself. This deck is a 79 card tarot deck. Most tarot decks are 78 cards. And this one has an extra unnamed card. And I absolutely love extra cards in tarot decks. I'll just leave them in sometimes. Like, why the heck not? If an artist wanted there to be a 79th card, who am I to say no to that? It's very, very rare that I'll actually take them out. In this case, it's also profoundly beautiful to me. All of these very subtle color variations, blues and purples, these kind of normal-ish looking symbols that feel very mysterious put together, and also just like purposefully odd. Like, it's centered, but then it hooks over to the edge and it doesn't quite make a perfect circle. All these things that make you think like, what is happening there? And then there is no context because there's no name. There's also so much black used on this card. And as you can see from some of my other favorites, black is not a big hitter in this deck. It is all about the colors, colors, colors. So I just think that's so cool. And I always love when an artist slips a little something extra in. It's almost like an extra signature on the whole deck. Like, yep, this one's mine, and here's the reason why. These images really stand out to me, again, because they feel iconic. Like the Mastery card here is maybe not even one of my favorites from the deck, but it's always going to be totally just in my heart, Lion King style, because of the trim job that I did in the original deck and just kind of botched the whole thing. I really, really love the court cards in this deck, specifically the brothers. There is so much energy and life to these. You can see like chakras in this one, and just like he's standing in water, but he also kind of like is light and water. This one you can see muscle fibers and tendons like exploding and growing and changing. I think there's feathers over here. This dude's arms are just kind of evaporating, but he himself is very statue-like. They're so cool. They are people. Court cards are traditionally people, like a knight, a queen, a king, or in this case, a mother, a brother, a father, a son. But they're so abstracted that it brings you back to the realm of just a beautiful piece of work instead of necessarily having it be a person. You could read this as a person. You can also read this as an experience. You could read that as a space. There's so much more to look at. I did mention the colors too. I am a color junkie. I'm also a light junkie. So the more light that is in a card and the more color that's in a card, I typically like it more. And when I say light, I mean something like the disc behind this guy's head. Obviously, it's not producing light. It's an image on a page, but it looks like it's glowing. And I just love being in illuminated spaces, and I think that light brings a lot to a composition. So I wouldn't want something to be totally blown out or like completely white, but the idea of light breathing into a card is very appealing to me. I'm also just glancing around at this, and not surprising to myself at all, I am loving all the centralized compositions here. Just things that are directly in the center of the canvas that are basically symmetrical. I was a huge symmetry guy when I was young, to the point where my mom was like worried that I was like OCD about having things be totally symmetrical. And I have since, removed that from myself. But there is still something very appealing about having a mostly symmetrical image. It just looks nice. It looks balanced. But if you take like the Three of Fire here, there are some differences on either side, like maybe color variations that help breathe a little bit more interest and excitement into a deck. I just bought the guidebook for this, which is a behemoth, and I'm very excited to dive in because this is actually very Thothy. Kind of referring back to that first deck that I had. Works, for example, is the same title for the Three of Discs in the Thoth as it is here. But many of these are totally different, like Birth of Light, The Crossing, Rainbow Mirror. These are extra names that the artist has put into the work to kind of help describe what these cards mean. And I'm really excited to kind of dig in and see what all those are. But that brings us to the end of this deck. Let's move on to the next. I'm working with some natural light today, so we'll see things get brighter and darker just kind of as the clouds ebb and flow. I think that's kind of cool. It'll add a little bit of variation. Up next, we have the Mary L. Tarot, another one of the top 5 decks that I just couldn't live without. Absolutely gorgeous and beautiful. This is yet another deck that has been created with traditional media, so painted, and then reproduced on cards. I don't know if I said it for the Arcane Bullshit deck, but that is what is called a vector style image, where you create art digitally using essentially math. You provide points, and then the computer fills in everything in between those points. And I'm really always very irritated when people say things like, oh, the computer did it for you, or digital art's not as hard as traditional art, blah, blah, blah. False. I am a huge proponent of, art being not just challenging, but beautiful and powerful and just as cool regardless of the tools you use. It is just a choice of, how you decide to express your vision. That being said, there is something very impressive about someone being able to render a tiger like this using literal paint on literal canvas. That is insane to me. As someone who draws constantly, I can't even begin to tell you how impressive that is. Another thing that I like about this deck is that a lot of the images are really, really different. Take this Judgment card, for example. It's extremely abstract. It is almost completely red, just with some tiny little hints that allow you to kind of take in the whole image and actually give it form. There are some bits that look very flat, like the Nine of Swords. This water, for example, is not particularly realistic. It looks a little bit kind of cartoony, still gorgeous. The background buildings don't look particularly spacious. They almost could be like a cardboard cutout. There is a little bit of differentiation, but it almost looks like a diorama, pieces of things that are flat put forward to backwards. Then you get a card like the Four of Cups, where we have this very kind of ephemerally rendered shell and water. It's not particularly realistic in a sense of photorealism, but it does have a very realistic quality to it, and that you can definitely tell what's there in a way that you kind of can't here. This feels much more gestural and abstract, where you can definitely very clearly see this is water, a rock, more water, a beach, and a shell. But it's got a very painterly quality to it. And then we get up to this tiger, which is like photorealistic. That could be a snapshot of a tiger placed onto a painting. Obviously, it's not. It's more beautifully kind of integrated and rendered in. But all of these different styles of art together make this deck what it is for me. And normally, I feel like that would be kind of a big turnoff on a deck, because it's like all these different pieces of art together that don't necessarily fit. But knowing that it was one artist, knowing that it took her this long to create, it feels like we get to kind of watch the journey of her grow and change over time, which is so cool. Plus, she just draws gorgeous stuff. Marie White is the artist. I forget if I said that or not. I'm just so excited about it. I'm losing myself. Shout out to the Temperance card here. Temperance is one of my favorite cards anyway, but look at this friggin' tiger in the water. He's like, yeah, I could kill you instantly, but instead I'm going to play in the pool for a little while, and that's just going to be fine. Incredible card, just absolutely gorgeous. And then just like the opposite colors from the color wheel here, orange and this kind of teal blue, flawless, absolutely gorgeous. Even things like linking together a couple of cards like the moon and the sun. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. I recently bought this little pouch to hold my Mary L in. I threw away a bunch of the boxes for my tarot decks, which made me very sad because, well, now I don't have anywhere to put them. And also, I don't want to leave them out and exposed to the sun. The sun just has a way of ruining everything, as well as also being life-giving and, you know, the reason that we're all here. I get it. Thank you, sun. I appreciate you. But it is nice to have a little baggie for them. Okay, I think I've talked enough about maybe not necessarily this deck, but just enough stuff here. So let's move on to the next. It was at this point in my sort of divinatory card reading journey that I wanted to try and branch out a little bit. I got the Marielle and instantly realized that it was extremely different, that tarot was not one thing, but many things. And I got really frustrated, to be honest. I still wish there was like one tarot deck that was the tarot deck and all other tarot decks are based on it. But that is just not true. There are many different places where tarot is kind of birthed from. There are like old decks or the oldest decks, and those tend to be like French and Italian. But there's also another deck which you'll see coming up that was done in England, I want to say. That's where the Golden Dawn was. Either way, it's called the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. And that arguably jump-started tarot into kind of our modern world. But I digress. I found other divinatory card systems. I Ching is actually, I believe, based on like flipping coins. And it's, where are we going here? Let me just show you some of the cards. It's based on these symbols. So kind of these lines and these broken lines. And every single card has 6 of them on it. And it's just a different combination of those 6. Before I forget, this particular I Ching deck is by Klaus Holitzka. Thank you, Klaus. It's very beautiful. This is not tarot at all. This is a completely different system and one that I am incapable of reading. I had the best intention of learning kind of something new. Then it quickly occurred to me that tarot was so big and expansive that that was going to be sort of what I dedicated my time to. But this deck is so gosh darn beautiful that I still have it around. This is another deck that was done traditionally, watercolor, but there's a heavy amount of digital manipulation. And I don't mean that they change things around digitally, but there's a lot of like color correction and kind of adjustments. Some things that kind of tip you off to that is that there is pure white on this card. You can't see any of the grain of the paper it was actually drawn on. In this card, let's say, you can start to see some of that paper texture come through in these gray areas. So you can really tell it was done traditionally. Also, just you can't get marks like this using digital material. I mean, you can, but it takes an insane amount of work. And like that smudge with that blurring, no way. I would challenge any digital artist to make this many cards look that convincing digitally. It would be surreal. I think these were definitely done traditionally. But you take a card like this and you're losing a lot of that kind of extra little detail. It almost looks pixelated in a way. You're losing a lot of the grays and it's just white and black. That's when you turn up the contrast on an image, so you make the darks darker and the brights brighter. You lose all these subtle middle grays. And on some cards like this, where there's a harsh edge, it's easy enough to kind of just block out things that are around the harsh edge. But for something like this, where it's a much more blurry edge, it's harder to define, you just have to kind of lose some detail to get the cards purely white. All that being said, it is gorgeous and stunning. They did a really nice job getting the cards to be stark white, and I'm glad they did. I think it was a really smart choice just because of, kind of the aesthetic of the deck. White, red, and black, crisp, clean, done. If there was all this extra gray, you would really lose something in this. One little thing that I'm still kind of torn on is the fact that the artwork is clipped on some of these cards, and it's actually clipped on every single card. You just can't see it on the cards that have white on the bottom. So it's at least consistent the entire way through. But you take a look at a card like this, which is just beautiful and floats perfectly in the center of the card, and then this where you're like, oh, but there's more of it. And it makes me want to see the rest. I'd be curious to see what this deck looks like with the images running directly off the edge of the card. One thing that does do, though, I'm going to grab the deck back here, and I learned this from the deck that I'm making, is it changes how the edges of the deck look. So on this deck, it's all just red for the backs and then pure white on the fronts. That's because no image goes beyond that border. If you had taken some of these borders to the edge, you'd be able to see little dark pockets peeking up throughout the deck itself. So I do really appreciate that. When you kind of spread them out, they look stunning. I'm going to put these guys back in the box. I'm going to do that later. Looking at the images themselves, they're all very singular. And when I say that, I mean that, we have here a group of people, but that's it. They're not in a space. They do have space because we can see some perspective here. Some people are closer, some people are farther. They're underneath this red sphere, but that's it. They are isolated images that are almost taken out of context. Even something like this, where we have a person standing on a path that goes back to a mountain, that is technically space, but there is no other context to that space at all. We are looking at a single chunk of something removed from a greater scene. There should be a sky. There should be the rest of the road here. There should be all these extra details, maybe even some extra mountains. We're not even seeing the bottom of the mountain. The artist specifically and deliberately ripped these scenes out of reality, placed them kind of abstractly into this ambient negative white space, and I think that's extremely successful. Another thing that's extremely successful is the use of the red dot throughout each of these images. It is this cadence that carries you through one card to the other. Because they're all kind of stylistically very different, smeary, pinkish red watercolor with, stark black people with, kind of mixing of both with just black and no smeary watercolor at all. You need some sort of consistency to hold everything together. And there's also, I'm not sure if you saw it when I held up the card before, all of the lines here are like this slightly metallic gold, and they're very, very pretty. I do wish I could read I Ching a little bit better. There are actually I Ching associations in the Thoth deck and also in another deck that I'll show you coming up here. But for now, I can't. And I'll just appreciate this as a beautiful deck. I'm limiting myself these days to just 15 decks of cards. And if there are some other tarot decks that come up, this is probably one that'll bite the dust just because I can't use it currently. But with that being said, for now, it's gorgeous and it's in, and let's go on to the next. Coming up next, we have the Masonic Tarot deck, and this is by John Bouchard. Yes, we're going to go with that. Good old JB. JB I can pronounce. This was another one of the top 5 decks that I just couldn't imagine living without. I initially saw this on another YouTube channel, Sacred Seed, and the gal who ran Sacred Seed, Elle, just is kind of gone with the wind these days, and it makes me so sad because she had this really kind of sassy way of explaining cards and talking about what she liked, and I just love it. And these things are pretty big, so I'm sure they're not going to fit, but we'll get most of the stuff on here. I just stopped talking for a while because I was looking at these cards and thinking, damn, they're pretty. And I think that every single time I see them, most of what I have out here are the major arcana. That's really the standout in this deck. Those are the big named cards like the Sun or the Fool or Temperance or the Magician. And there is this really interesting initiatory take on that set of cards. And they're just stunning. And they're also very different. And they're also huge. I can just say so many cool things about this deck. As just a physical object, it is so satisfying to hold and manipulate and just like experience in real life. Just to kind of bring it back here for a second, let's take one of the Tarot of the Spirit cards just for size comparison. Like the deck is enormous. It's totally big. It's totally cool. And the other thing I like about it is kind of like the weird factor of it. This hand that's a cup, for example, or the Emperor here is like sitting in an egg. The Sun is like two people who have like crazy frizzy static hair, and they're on this bright pink and blue. Like nothing really makes sense. It all kind of makes sense symbolically, but from image standpoint, it's just throwing all these different motifs at you. It's never letting your eyes settle. If you were around from my first video where I talked about the 5 decks I couldn't live without, I talked about how each of the court cards and each of the minors drastically change up the border for every single card. And that just carries through the whole deck, that kind of never being able to settle or never knowing exactly what you're going to see. Even take some of the cards from the minor arcana here. The Fool's border ends here, where Temperance goes to the bottom. Temperance's corners are rounded with gold on the edge, where the Sun's are circles of gold with colors. But now we come over to the Wheel of Fortune, which has the same formatting as the Fool, but the border goes down and now it's gold and there's a rhombus. Like it just never ever is the same. It's always throwing something new at you. And I so appreciate that. There is time and love and attention given to each and every one of these images. Now, as far as the style of art, I can't figure it out. I don't actually know what they used. It almost gives me like, I know it's not this, but like an airbrushed or like a spray painted vibe. I am pretty certain that this is, I'm going to say traditionally made, but now I'm second guessing myself because there is so much consistency. I don't actually know, to be honest, but that's cool. I think not being able to pin down the artistic style is just another thing about this deck that makes you go like, huh, how did they actually do that? And that's pretty cool in my book. This might be one that I really want to break down a little bit more. I'm going to start a series called Giving a Deck the Prism Treatment, where I go very in-depth in kind of an art analysis way. And there's another deck which I'll show you that is up first on the docket, but this one is definitely going to be part of that list just because of how cool all the images are, and there's so much to sort of unpack. Okay, I could look and talk about the Masonic Tarot my entire life, but to spare you all that, let's move on to the next. It's so funny, I say spare you all like I'm forcing you to watch the video or something. It's mostly just stopping myself from endlessly talking, because I'll be here all day, and quite frankly, I got stuff to do. It's mostly this. This is the stuff that I have to do, but I want to talk about other decks too. Next up, we have the Handel Tarot, and I just tried to find the full name for this guy, but Handel is his last name. I feel like it's Herman Handel, but I also feel like I'm making that up. So just know that he has a full name. It's important and special to me. I just don't have it committed to memory. I love the backs of this tarot deck. It's just so intense with this eye staring at you. It's like, oh, that eye's a little bit intense. I'm going to go to the, oh my God, another eye. And I just love eyes as a symbol in general. They're very piercing and insightful and mysterious. Oh, I'm going to talk like this for the entire rest of the deck. That's not true. We're going to go back to this. This is yet another deck that was painted traditionally. And then, either photographed or scanned, and those images were put onto the cards. Again, there's just something very satisfying about having hand-painted images. You can really feel it when an artist gives different elements of their card a lot of love. For example, he could have easily superimposed these cups on after the fact, but he did not. You can see the individual strokes on these cups, and that they're different from each other. You can tell that he literally drew in or painted in each sword. He painted in each petal of the flower. And that's just cool. That is an artist who loves their craft and loves what they do. And that level of dedication, skill, and attention to detail really translates to the work in a powerful way. I think these are some of the most kind of arresting images in a tarot deck that I own. And I don't necessarily mean that from like the arcane bullshit deck, for example. That is arresting because it's offensive. It is loud. It is brash. It's hilarious. These are, now I forget the word that I used, intense or arresting or whatever, just because of their oddity. Take some of these minor cards here, for example. They're in these spaces that you can't really make out. Like this looks like, rock with maybe trees behind it and snow, but there's also like another rock up here, but that almost looks like a tree at the top. There's like optical illusions that kind of blend into some of these minor cards. This maybe looks like we're looking down into a pool of water, but maybe also up through a tree at the sky. You can never quite nail it down. In the death card here, we have this giant bird that is next to very small grass. So is it just close to us? Is it in front of the grass? But that grass is also sitting in front of this skeletal arm, which is in front of the bird, which makes me think that this bird is huge. And then there's a figure far in the distance. But if this bird is so big, either this arm is very small. Again, just really odd, unique little things that make your mind go, huh, all right, I could see that. And there's also just kind of generally a very kind of Mary L. change in the style of art here too. I think you can really see it, kind of the progression of him as an artist over time. Take the Ace of Swords, which I think is downright stunning. Look at that Ace of Swords. You know what? We're just going to pause here for a second because I just... That was a delightful little moment. This has been an Ace of Swords moment with Colin. But if you take a look at that Ace of Swords compared to the Two of Swords, they're rendered completely different. And I don't just mean that the swords themselves are different, but here we go. I'm going to bring these up again. The kind of clarity of these swords, or the contrast in these swords, is so much higher. There are very distinct lines that separate things. Each side of the sword has very little color variation. They're nearly solid colors on both sides, where this sword has all these beautiful reflections in it, and it kind of changes subtly over time, and it almost looks like a softer metal than these swords. And neither one of them is rendered better than the other. They're just so different stylistically. That happens with the wands too. I don't have any of the wands here, but the Ace of Wands looks like it's from a completely different deck than the rest of the set, which I just think is so interesting. And again, normally that would kind of bother me, but there is such craftsmanship and there is such care and just like cool ideas put into this deck that it really doesn't bug me. And I don't have to like every card. In a set of 78 images, you are bound to, or I guess I'm bound to anyway, dislike something. There is basically 0% chance that you will like every single card in a deck. I'm trying to think if there are any decks like that. If they come up, I'll let you know. But this deck just allows me to escape into this weird, illusory place. And for that, I really appreciate it. And for that, I'm also going to move on. Because, well, I'm going to. Nailing all of these transitions. Can't stop me now. The next deck needs no introduction if you are involved in the tarot community at all. For those of you who might be newer, though, this is the Wild Unknown Tarot by Kim Krans. This is a tarot deck, another one in the long line of traditionally created tarot decks. This is black ink and colored watercolor on paper. And it's another one that is very much kind of digitally processed. So we very rarely see the actual paper texture in these cards. It's always just pure white. Also, especially with cards like this where you see a lot of little chunky short lines, they often look digitally manipulated. They look a little bit too sharp or a little bit blurry. Just some of the artifacting that comes from that digital process. And again, not bad at all. I think it actually gives the deck a very iconic look. Just a little interesting note. This is the first deck that I'm going to be doing the Prism treatment to. This deck has gotten so much attention and so much love, but the thing that I always wanted to see from reviews of this deck were how are the colors actually used, or the lines, what ties things like the fours together in this deck or breaks them apart, how much unity is there actually. All those types of things fascinate me. If we're going to take a look at a tarot deck like a mini compact museum, an art gallery if you will, of 78 images, I want to break it down. I want to take a look at this artist's body of work in this particular collection and talk about it. Is it cohesive? Is it not? So keep a lookout for that. The Wild Unknown Tarot will be getting the first Prism treatment. Taking a look at the deck itself, it's very iconic. And it is iconic in many ways in that it is sort of an icon within the tarot community. Basically, everybody knows or owns this deck. But it's also iconic in its imagery in that there are icons that appear over and over again. For example, pine trees. You can see in a couple of these cards right away, we have basically the same silhouetted pine tree. Or animals that tend to appear over and over again, like birds or butterflies. There are just many, many motifs that weave themselves in and out. And it's funny, like you look through this deck the first time and you're just like blown away by the cool styling and all the imagery, but there's a ton of repetitiveness in this deck. And I don't use repetitiveness in a bad way. I think it actually helps really tie some cool narrative threads through. It's just imagery that's used over and over again to help establish cadence and rhythm. And I think that's so cool. This is the third edition of this deck, the mass market edition. And some of the cards were changed, like the Four of Swords here. And you can really tell that Kim Krans is getting better as an artist. This is her first tarot deck. I don't know what her experience was or her art life was before this, but some of these images are not rendered the best, to be totally honest. Some of the animals look a little bit off. Some of the compositions are a little bit flat. I only say that because I also have her second deck, which I'll show off in this collection too. And she's releasing images of her third deck, the Wild Unknown Archetypes. And if you put an image from the Wild Unknown Archetypes deck next to any one of these, you can tell how much she's grown as an artist. And I think that is incredible. Everyone is always constantly learning. I would never expect anybody to be perfect, well, first of all, ever, or to always have the same quality of work throughout their career. And I'm also not trying to down this deck in any way, shape, or form. I think it is so impressive. It obviously speaks to so many people. I'm just excited to see somebody growing as an artist and excited to kind of participate in that, and she gets to share it with us too. Taking a look at some of these images, the reasons I picked these particular cards out were for kind of that POW iconography. Things like Judgment or the Seven of Wands, having this kind of glowing, radiating thing at the top that is shining light down into these dark spaces. Things like the Tower and the Moon, where we have these really intense dark spaces with this crack of color, whether that's the moon or this lightning and fire, kind of bordered by these very vibrant edges that almost kind of disappear. Or even something like the Ten of Swords. This is a really tough image to look at, but every single Ten of Swords in pretty much every deck is tough because it's swords stabbing something. But look at how powerful and mysterious it is. It is giving so much credence to the swords and almost like saying that this buffalo or this, I think it's a buffalo animal, doesn't matter just because it is so lovingly and caringly hidden away in the work. It's basically already dissolving or decaying into the earth that is kind of created by these dark spaces. And it even kind of looks like it's raining down on it. It's so powerful and it speaks so much using only one color, which I think is so cool. And then also some of these cards that just have really beautifully done watercolor work. I think the reason so many people like watercolors are these kind of bleeding, smeary things that watercolors can do that just is very difficult to reproduce in almost any other style of painting. And those sing really brightly. She is a very, very talented watercolor artist, and that shows in spades in this deck. I'll stop here because, like I said, I'm going to be going real deep on the art of this deck, and I cannot wait for it. If there are any decks that you see in this video that you think would be good candidates for the Prism treatment, let me know. And obviously you'll know more about what that looks like once I release the video, but I'll be curious to hear. On to the next. The next deck up here is the Albano Weight deck by the, I suppose, maybe infamous artist Frankie Albano. This is one of those very foundational tarot decks that I was talking about earlier. I was kind of lamenting about how there are no, true core tarot decks. Like there isn't one that you can point to and say, this is tarot. There kind of is. I think this deck makes a really good argument if there was going to be one. Also, some of the really early Marseille decks do that too. But even within something like the Waite Smith deck, which is this artwork, there's a million different colorations of it. Pamela Coleman Smith was the original artist who drew all this line work. And then there have been just a million different ways that people have painted and recolored and changed those, which again, to my kind of like logical brain, just makes me scream and say, please just give us like the one de facto tarot deck. It would make everybody's lives so much easier. It'd be so cool to see what the original one was. But the fact that we don't have that, I think, speaks perfectly to what tarot is as a whole. It is this mysterious thing that, everyone can kind of bring their own selves to and just kind of throw on different literal coats of paint and have it mean different things. And that, quite frankly, is amazing. I got this deck because I wanted a Rider-Waite Smith deck or a Waite Smith deck. And again, that's referring literally to these outlines with a specific coloration. I first got the plaid backs, and I didn't like them. They were very blue and gray and boring. And then again on Elle's channel, Sacred Seed, I saw this, the Albano Weight, and it's so cool. There are so many unique colorations, like the gold in the back of the Temperance card and this crappy rainbow, the dark blue and the little blue hat of the Hermit. Just a lot of cool stuff. And I think at this point, me in color, the more color, the better. And I'm just in. I was totally sold when I saw it. I picked basically all major arcana for this because they are so ridiculously iconic. When people think of tarot cards, even people who don't really know what tarot is, they're often thinking of these images, the Hermit or Death. Like you see those and you instantly know what they are, even if you don't really know what they are. That's the reason I picked this Three of Swords too. I actually don't like this as a card image. The image itself is fine, but for what this card means from the way that I read tarot, this is nothing like it. But it's so iconic. If somebody has a tattoo of a tarot card, I would bet money every single time that it is this depiction of the Three of Swords, just because of how kind of pervasive it is in tarot subculture. I think it's kind of cool. From an artistic perspective, this deck has gone through so much that it feels like tired to me. The original line work was done. I'm sure it has been scanned and rescanned and photographed a million times over, digitally colored, recolored, reprinted, remastered, re-whatevered. I'm sure this is just some hodgepodge of digitalness that, made this deck what it is here. But even through all that, it's still amazing and iconic and super cool. We do get to see some of that artifacting, though, in a card like Death, where all these lines are just smearing together and blurring. We're losing tons of the detail just because humanity has taken these lines by the shirt cuffs and shaken them until nothing was left. I say nothing was left. There's plenty left, and it's totally beautiful. But these are my top 10 favorites from the Albano Weight. And I say let's move on to the next. Oh, I'm just having so much fun. I hope you guys are enjoying this too. Next up, we have the Ancient Italian Tarot. And that name gets me a little bit because I don't know if I would describe this as ancient. When I think ancient, I think like cave paintings, but that's just me. The artist for this is anonymous as far as I know, so my apologies for not being able to credit them, but it's really, really stunning. This is the most representative of a style of tarot deck called Marseille that I have, and it's not really a traditional Marseille deck. That's actually a big gap that I have in my collection currently. But what that refers to is the pip cards, or these guys here. Tarot is basically just glorified playing cards in a lot of ways. And there are 4 suits, just like there are in a deck of cards. So you have cups, which could be hearts, coins, which could be diamonds, swords, which are spades, all that kind of stuff. And where many of the decks we've seen so far have fully illustrated pips, these are just literal pip cards. There are 9 cups on this page. There are 3 coins on this page, and there's some filigree around the edge. That being said, that filigree really sells me. It's gorgeous. Like, a lot of time and effort was put into making that beautiful. Even something as simple as the fabric tied around these swords or the branch that appears. One thing that really bugs me about this deck, this is the 8 of Swords, and there are 16 swords on this card. Just going to throw that out there. 16 is not 8. It does really help distinguish them from the wands, though. So from a reading standpoint, that's very nice. But I don't know. I like numbers and that they mean something. And that feels a little bit weird to me. In my time with this deck, though, my fury about that has cooled. Fury is also a really strong word. It did mildly irritate me for like a little while. Again, I picked out a lot of the major arcana here just because there are so many of these pip cards. And these are really, really gorgeous. From what I can tell, these are etchings that were printed. So if we look at, say, the Judgment card, we have a ton of cross-hatching, or several lines moving in one direction and then moving in a different direction in sort of various combinations to achieve light and dark. I am 100% certain that there is a heaping handful of digital manipulation that has been applied to this deck, because the ancient Italian tarot was at least made, centuries ago. So the idea that all of those colors or whatever would somehow make it through, no way. And probably all the cards didn't even make it. I'm sure they had to remake some of them. I am no tarot historian. I do not know that. But just looking at the images themselves, they're stunning. They have this very old quality to them. We don't render images like this, much anymore. Bodies don't tend to look like this. We really hyper stylize people. This gal's got some curves on her, and I totally love that. Also, some things like the High Priestess's face here, it almost looks dirty in a way, and maybe a little bit unproportional, which I think is cool. It makes it look like this is a real person kind of existing in a real space. And also some of the proportions are a little bit odd, like her hand looks a little bit small, and her arm and shoulder look enormous. That's a real indication of kind of the times. As you go back in history, it's taken time for people to figure out how to draw humans. Humans are incredibly complicated to draw, not just because there's lots of moving pieces on them, but because we just look at them so often. All of our days typically are filled with staring at people. So when you see an image of a person that's not correct, you think like, something's off about that. And it's often difficult to kind of nail that down. Not all of them, but like some of them are a little bit odd. But like take her neck, for example. Her neck is very long and thin and kind of bows out. And then her jawline comes down and we're just missing any sort of neck-chin attachment there. It almost, like from here, looks like she has twisted her neck all the way back around and is looking at this dude like owl style. Again, I only bring it up because I find it really charming. I can't draw people to save my life, so these are way better than I could do. I just think it's really interesting. The thing that I like about this deck, even more than the art, though, is how it reads, which is not true with basically any other tarot deck that I have. This deck is just an old, grumpy man to me. If I ask it a question, it answers with a big sigh, then a very blunt answer, and then like, are you done here? Because I was taking a nap and you woke me up. And that makes me smile. I don't often personify my decks, but this one has a real personality to it. Okay, cool. I think let's go on to the next. The next deck in my collection is more of an honorable mention because this is a deck that I made. This is the 18 Oracle. If you are curious about this, I actually just made a full walkthrough going really deep on all the cards and kind of what they mean and how I made it. You'll notice that this deck is not included in the 15 that I said that I have. That is part of the rule I made for myself. If I make a deck of cards, I get to keep it no matter how many I have. And currently that's like 1 3/4. So not doing too bad so far. On to the next. The next deck up on the list needs very little introduction. It is the wonderful Fountain Tarot. And this packaging just, speaks to me. We have this reflective title that you can't see from some angles in this glorious, like prismatically reflective box that is just so full of colors that I don't think I can actually stand it. So I'm going to move this to the side. As far as my 10 favorite cards go, I actually realized that I didn't pick cards that are very emblematic of the deck. This deck has been described as very airy, very full of either the element air or just air in general. And I think one of the main reasons for that is because there is so much of the color white in this deck. If you were to look at, let me just place these guys here. If you were to look at a card like the Moon, it is extremely dark and oppressive. And oppressive images actually have an impact on the body. You know, color psychology is a huge thing. Like, colors make us feel things and mean things. Oops, sorry about that. Let me silence my phone. Looking here, this card doesn't want you to be in it. It wants to push you away. Black tends to press itself up against the surface of an image and create a barrier. Same thing with the bottom of the Three of Swords here. It is dark. It is difficult to look at. There is no way to get into that space because there is nothing to see. Whereas this bubble, which is full of light, invites you inside of it. It gives you breathing room. It allows you to kind of experience the space or imagine yourself in it. Take the Ace of Swords, for example. Not nearly as oppressive on the side. We can kind of see through almost this glass feeling. But the center looks deep. It looks as if there is space to go into. And that amount of space gives you a very airy feeling. The other thing in this deck that reads as airy to me is how, I was going to say smeary it is, but I think bloomy. Bloom is the word I was looking for. There is a technique or a style of photography where light peaks around the edges of objects. It is very clearly seen. I'm actually going to grab a card out because there's a perfect example of this. It's also called light leak sometimes. And that is also called bloom, as I mentioned. Here we go. It's this light peeking over the edge. We have the sun right there. Even though you can't see it, you know there is a light source directly there because that is how light behaves in lenses. And it's that very subtle kind of blooming, you can see it all over the place, that again fills these cards with light and a softness. And air is very soft. It is not hard. In fact, it is the opposite of hard. You see these black onyx pillars, and nobody in their right mind probably would describe those as airy. They are dense. They are hard. Where if you have light spilling into a card, that's airy. That's open. That gives you room both, physically and kind of conceptually to breathe and be in that space. And I think that's pretty cool. And it happens very successfully all throughout this deck. The images that I find to be really successful are the ones with less people and more like objects in them. The people are rendered really beautifully in this deck. I just tend to like decks that have less people in them in general. This card in particular, first of all, is super cool. Like, the composition is incredible, but it also looks a lot like my brother Nick, which is just so funny to me. I just see him every time I look at that card. This is another one where it's just full of space and air because it looks like we're looking at the corner of a wall and there'd just be so much actual air in this room. All of these are oil paintings. So they were done pretty big, but not enormously, and then again reproduced for the actual deck itself. Hold, please. I forgot to look at the artist. There are 3 people that worked on this deck. I am pretty sure that Jonathan Sayes, I'm going to say Sayes, is the artist on this one because the writer and the designer, I believe, did the graphic design and the writing. So yes, to all 3 of you, really bravo. This was a team effort and just absolutely gorgeous. The last thing I want to call out about this deck is the use of color, or more accurately, the use of like monochromatic palettes or non-color. There is color in the deck. There are pops of lights and darks. There's technically a whole rainbow of colors on this card. But if you look at it holistically, this deck as not as individual pieces, but as a whole work, it is mostly white, which I think is really cool. It is very unique, especially from the things that we've seen in the other decks. and where many decks like the Wild Unknown or the Ancient Italian Tarot or other decks that I'm now forgetting about, the I Ching deck that we saw, those had white as negative space. This deck uses white as a color. And I know white's not technically a color, but white is wielded here the way that someone might wield blue or green, where white was simply the canvas upon which those other decks were created. And I think that's another reason that this deck is very airy, because white is not the background. It is a color that is deliberately used heavily throughout the deck. Totally stunning, but I think it's time for the next. Up next, created by the wonderful Tina Gong, is the Golden Thread Tarot. This whole deck is so satisfying because it is matte black and beautiful shimmering gold. Even the box itself, totally gorgeous. This deck is heavily based on that Albano Waite deck, that original artwork, the Rider Waite art. And I'm so thankful this is showing up so well, because I did not know how this was going to work with the super reflective gold. I think it's so cool to almost see no image, see it super reflect, and then boom, look kind of matte. Oh, did we lose it? There's going to be a little pocket right there, I guess. Okay, well, we'll shift those around. That is one thing with this deck, is it's very kind of spatially sensitive. Right here, this is my iPad, the vehicle upon which I am creating this video. So I'll shift them around in a little bit. This deck, though, is created with vector style artwork. So again, all computer generated with very extremely crisp, even lines. There we go. So shimmery. And that's one thing that I really like about this particular use of vector art. Everything is exactly the same line width or weight of line. When vector images get a little more loosey-goosey with their lines, I tend to like them less. It feels a little bit lazy in some ways to me. The artist restricted herself to only using that single thickness of line, which creates a beautiful unity among the deck and also just stunning images. If these lines were different, we wouldn't have this incredible pattern in the background, and it also wouldn't feel as much of a piece. It would feel like some of the lines weren't as important as others. It would feel a lot less flat, which in this particular deck, I think the flatness is a boon, because it's not about space, it's about line. It's about positive and negative space. I'm gonna pick up these guys again, just to give them a little bit more light and a little bit more love. Whoa, this is like a weird trip trying to get these to reflect. So cool. I also like the variation in how much line is shown on the page. Two of Swords, for example, is very dense with line, where the Five of Cups, you could probably count the number of lines here in, I was going to say one hand, but there's a lot of lines on there. But there's a lot of negative space. That's what I'm going for. So she wasn't afraid to really let the cards breathe and to give them space, but also to fill them with beautiful filigree. Just whatever the card needed, that's what you applied. There are some really oddball cards in this deck, like the Ten of Wands, for how much this deck holds true to its source material. There's a lot of cards that really just kind of Fleetwood Mac style go their own way. I love the almost Egyptian feel of this card with the scarab at the bottom and the crossing wands. And oh man, this Empress card with that beautiful headdress and the bonsai trees in the background. They are absolutely stunning. This is also, again, just a really unique deck to hold in the hands, because it's plastic playing card stock. This deck is apparently waterproof too, although I am not brave enough to actually put it in water. And then it's got whatever this gold foiling is on top. It's interesting because this side is very smooth. The backs, you can actually feel the gold foil a little bit, just a hair, and it seems to want to come off a little bit more. I'm just more curious from a printing perspective how they did that. Just based on the fact that it's so hard to actually film this deck, I think I'm going to move on to the next, but I love it just as much as the rest. Please welcome back to the stage, Kim Kranz. Kim Kranz was, of course, the artist from earlier who did the beautiful Wild Unknown Tarot. But like I was saying when we talked about this, we can really see Kim developing as an artist in this deck. And I think that's so cool to be able to see her now very iconic signature style developed and expanded upon in a very unique way. I also wanted to show off this box because holy crap, it is absolutely gorgeous. I've never seen foiling quite like this with this sort of almost like pattern quality to it. It looks like ocean ripples or something. It is very, very cool and quite the object. Looking at the cards, which I have over here, there we go. They're stunning. Things that jump out to me right away as far as how Kim has developed as an artist, the very first thing is line quality. So much of the Wild Unknown Tarot has the same line quality to it. And what I mean by that is that the lines feel very consistent, almost vector-like we saw in the Golden Thread Tarot. They're very consistent. They don't change a lot. There's also a real consistency to the length and shape of lines. Horizontal lines are a big thing in the deck, or radial lines that come out, or these little short chunks of line. Where now, let's take a look at these radial lines here, and we have all different variations. We have long and short, and even a big dense chunk and a much smaller one around the outside. We have horizontal lines that kind of breathe and change their way down, but those are also mixed in with very organic, rounded lines. These lines also give so much more shape to their objects, where many of the shapes in the Wild Unknown were like this bear here, a lot of little hatch marks that bring out the detail and bring out the shape, or even in the deer. These lines follow the contours of the object, so they are curved lines showing that this worm is a curved shape. We can see a lot of returning themes too, like the interior of this worm really reflecting that Three of Wands that we saw before, those three wands that were in kind of a triangle with the almost portal in the center of them. Things like the center of Fire Ant here, this watercolor bleeding out like we saw on the Four of Swords earlier with the lamb on it. But there's a much bolder use of color. Dolphin, for example, we very rarely saw this much color, even on the rainbow cards in the Wild Unknown Tarot. And to be fair, I didn't pick out particularly colorful cards from that deck, but the boldness of the application of color in this deck feels much more intentional. You would have gotten a very smooth, you do get very smooth, even applications of color in that deck. On the butterfly, for example, we had a rainbow infinity symbol that it looked just like a smooth gradient rainbow, where here we have pockets of color. She's getting more confident in saying, it doesn't have to be smooth, it doesn't have to be perfect. The same thing with deer here, just letting the color kind of naturally bleed into the cards where it will. And a lot more use of non-rainbow, but alternating colors, like purples and pinks and greens and blues. We have some opposites from the color wheel here that we just don't see in the Wild Unknown. She's just breathing a lot more life into what she's doing, giving us a lot more variety, and also just rendering her animals a lot better too. This looks way more like an eagle than any bird does in the Wild Unknown Tarot. This dolphin looks a lot more realistic too. And she's still got like a signature style. It's not like they're photorealistic, but they are way more approaching realism than what she had before. And I think that's so cool, just again to see an artist kind of grow and develop and try something new. That Wild Unknown Tarot is so of a piece, and it's so kind of its own thing. This feels the same, but also very different. And I like that. I can really appreciate it. I also love on these spirit cards that there is just a little teeny tiny bit of foiling on that circle. Just a little elegant pop of fun to kind of splash in here. Totally gorgeous. I don't really use Oracle decks a whole lot, which is what this is. I'm a non-tarot deck, but it was so stunning and I like Kim's artwork so much that I just had to dive in and grab it. Like so many projects, this video has kind of taken on a life of its own, and I kind of love it. Up next, this is one of my two brand newest decks. This is La Corte de Tarocchi by Anna Marie D'Onofrio. We're going to go with that. Close enough. This deck is an Il Manighello deck, which, they're known for making super high quality products. This is my very first one. And one of the many things that I love about this deck is the size of the cards. They're super unique. They almost feel like bookmarks. And oh my God, the cardstock. I am not a cardstock snob, but holy crap. These are like beautiful watercolory cards. They're just gorgeous. But they've got a real unyieldingness to them. They don't want to bend at all. I just can't stand it. Normally I wouldn't even call it out, but this deck is so unique feeling that I just felt like I had to. Looking at my top 10 cards here, oh yeah, even just like laying these out, you can see that the size is very, very different than the other decks that we've looked at. These were all engraved cards, and I think that they were probably like linoleum or stone engraved, so, etching away at a hard material, then printed using a big press, and then all hand colored. And then these are digital reproductions of those hand colored decks. But the actual deck itself was handmade. So it was printed and then hand cut. So you get some really uneven borders on the edge. You get things like ink kind of spilling and bleeding off the sides. And all of those little elements are just so beautiful. It lends it this very handmade quality because it kind of is. I think it's so cool. There is something so charming about the art in this deck because in some ways it's kind of not great. If you look at the human figures here, like they're not rendered very well. If you were to say like, what does a human being look like? Not a ton like this, but that does not matter. This deck is not going for realism. It is 100% embracing style. This deck to me looks like medieval art through the lens of a kid. Like what would a 10-year-old in medieval times draw? It would kind of be this. I mean, there's clearly a lot more skill put into this than that, but just that's like the vibe that I get. And I think it's so cool. And because of the unique size of this deck, she had a really challenging restriction when making these cards, which is every composition has to be extremely vertical. And it doesn't sound that hard, but then you start to design images this way, and you get to card like 12 and you're like, oh, there's another one that's really tall and thin. So you see really cool things happen, like very long, tall figures and also very short figures. And there is not much in between. These are some of the only people I can think of in the deck that are kind of the in-between people. That's because the figure is either filling up the entirety of the card with just a little bit of accoutrement on the side, or they're taking up half of the card and there's something else on the other side. The Hanged Man, for example, is this little itty bitty, almost looking like a kid, with birds holding up some wreath above it. It's really cool. Those restrictions, again, lead to this sort of cadence and this style that carries throughout the whole deck. And I keep saying words like childish or inaccurate or things like that, which could be taken as negative terms. I assure you that this is, visually speaking, probably in my top 2 tarot decks right now. It has so much charm and style. I'm totally taken by it. I think it's absolutely beautiful. Those are just some of the words that kind of come to mind to help describe what this art looks like. Other things that I love about this deck are its very delicate but deliberate use of color. If you were to look at the Devil card here, this is a very red card, but taken out of context of the other ones, it begins to look more gray because the reds are so desaturated. The hues are skewing so far towards gray that it is difficult out of context to even understand the colors of a card. There are some exceptions. For example, the leg of this lion is orange and there's no denying it. The sun on this card is so super bright yellow. But those little bits of extreme color are like these little oases in a desert of near gray. But the magic of this deck is when you put it together, the colors sing. Looking at them like this, you can see, of course, the moon card is blue with green in the background. The world card is full of these glorious tans. The hermit's cape is very red upon a brown background with a blue sky. Death is deliberately very gray with this brown tree on the side. All the colors within context of each other begin to sing and come to life. And I think that is so cool. This deck is like a big puzzle almost. Out of context with each other, the cards look odd. Like, let's just take a look at Death here, for example. It looks like there's basically no color to Death, and it's like kind of crudely drawn. And if I had just seen this one image, I would have been like, whatever, I'll pass. But then you start to bring in other images along with it, and you're like, wait, okay, now all of a sudden in the context of this, really bright coloration, I can see that there are some pockets of color here. I can see where those decisions were made. I can see that even, here, there are some very desaturated elements. Let's bring in another card. And now all of a sudden it's like, oh, wait, I'm starting to see these very vertical compositions start to take place. So it's not that, death is crudely drawn. It's just simply drawn in kind of this vertical way along with this tree to start mirroring things like the High Priestess and how she also has a tree on the right-hand side. There's all these little echoes and cadences that carry through that really begin to make this deck like shine and sing in a way that I haven't seen in a lot of other decks. And I personally think that the biggest reason for that is the restriction of the card size. Just having such a limited canvas to work with forces you to get really creative in really kind of out of the box ways. And I think that was handled so insanely successfully in this deck. And also, this Sun and this Moon card are so cute that I can't stand it. And I'm not a really big fan of like cute things. I'm certainly not opposed to them, but I don't go out of my way to like collect cute decks, let's say. But oh, they're so sweet, those little faces. I just love them. Love, love, love. Love, 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 La Corte de Taroki, love, Anna, love, so good. I'm going to say love one more time. Love. The next deck up is the Mermaid Tarot by Ms. Dame Darcy, and I cannot believe that I bought this tarot deck. I cannot believe it. It's totally wild to me. I am not the biggest mermaid fan. Nothing against them, but they're not really my cup of tea. I don't like theme decks, and this is 150% a theme deck, and I don't typically like this style of art. And yet all of those things together have somehow looped around on my circles of interest from literally no interest to I am extremely into it. Let's take a look at some of the images. Looking at these here, they almost read like old vintage postcards to me, which I think is so cool. Part of that is just the color palette that's used. It feels very aged, like sun-bleached almost. Like the Empress here looks like it was very colorful at one point, but has kind of lost some of it. And also just the posing. This Nine of Swords, for example, doesn't look like an actual space. It looks like the photograph of a person superimposed with a whole bunch of tridents over it and a moon in the background. Or maybe even like the cover of a romance novel. And it's these very deliberate posed cards that are just absurd and ridiculous that make this deck sing so much to me. It's, I'm kind of thinking of it now. It's almost like a collage deck, but all of it's drawn instead of actually collaged in. Take the King of Wands, for example. This wand is so tiny. If you think about that size of that wand next to that dude's face, it looks like somebody photoshopped in an oar, but, obviously it's all hand drawn. And I think there's something about that that's so charming. It takes that idea of collage, but then gives it that really personal artist's touch. As far as I can tell, this deck was drawn using pen and marker. There are some marks, especially like in the Nine of Swords, you get kind of thick, blocky, chunky lines, or the Four of Swords too. There's a lot of very linear lines that are sharp on one side and tapered in kind of an organic way on the opposite that just feel very marker-like to me. I don't actually know what medium she used, but if I had to guess, that's what I'd put money on. A lot of the cards that I find successful in this deck are these portraits, just like a picture of a Queen of Swords, and she's wearing crazy awesome makeup, and then there's basically no other detail on her face. I think that's so cool. So cool, in fact, that I'm going to disrupt the little spread of cards here. I don't know what there is to say about this deck, quite frankly. It is so outside of my norm for what I'm usually into that it still blows my mind that I like it, but I just can't get enough of it. This is one of those decks that I just like flipping through and looking at just because each of the images is so unique and stunning. This is definitely another deck that I want to give the Prism treatment to, just because there's so much color and shape and space to dive into. And more than any other deck I own, all the images in this deck add up to a world. It almost feels with these theme decks like you're building a world instead of building a collection of singular images. I guess I'll leave it at that. We are down to just one deck left to go, but this is the end of all of my purchased decks. Last but certainly not least is the Prism Tarot. This is a tarot deck that I am currently working on, and I won't go on too much about it here. I do have an Instagram page dedicated largely to the Prism Tarot itself. You can find me at the underscore prism underscore tarot. I'll give you a quick peek at the cards if you haven't seen it before. This card is heavily based on intricately woven color systems. And that sounds really kind of self-serving when I say it that way, but it kind of is. I spent a lot of time developing ways in which colors interact with this deck. And I plan to spend a lot of time kind of breaking down some of that stuff here on YouTube. So if you're interested, keep an eye out because there's a lot more to come. Thanks again, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. It was an absolute blast to just kind of talk through the deck collection with you guys. It's so cool to just kind of take a look back through stuff that you have. I have all these decks and, I get to use them typically one at a time, but to look through each of them and find favorite cards and just what I like about them and get to talk about each one. So much fun. With that, I guess I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.